Okay, well, welcome everyone to our lecture, Out of the Shadows, Introducing the Music of the Polish Baroque. I'm John Radziłowski. I'm the director of the Polish Institute of Culture and Research here at the Orchard Lake campus. And it's my pleasure to introduce my own brother this time. And very fortunate to have Paul here to talk to us. Paul is a professor at Madonna University and has been there. It was also taught here at St. Mary's for a few years prior to the Madonna, moving over to Madonna when the college here closed. Paul got his undergraduate at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, and then his doctorate at University of Southern California. He's a specialist in medieval and early modern Polish history, and he has published a number of works and continues to be very active, as well as teaching, a very active researcher. He has published is working on the cathedral chapter of Kraków during the time of Jan Długosz, and has also done some work on Stanisław of Wielniów, and has actually translated a few of his poems into English and published those as well. He's very interested in cultural history and music, and in our family we have my other brother is a musician. But I struggled with the guitar. I think I got everyone started. I had a guitar.
Yes.
I failed completely in my guitar lessons, but then my younger brothers took it up and actually learned how to play the guitar and other instruments much better than I would ever be able to do. So without any further introduction, Paul,
right.
Please join us.
Thank you, John. And I would like to just say a little bit about the topic at the beginning and why I picked this title, Out of the Shadows, because it is a quite obscure topic, I think, to many people, even those who are otherwise aficionados of Polish culture. If there's a kind of Baroque art they know, it's architecture and visual art, perhaps, but not so much the music. And that's really too bad. Because there's actually some very, very interesting and valuable monuments of music that come out of the Polish Baroque. Broadly conceived, the Baroque was an international artistic culture, as many of you probably have some awareness at least, and maybe know very well. But it also had local variants, and just as in architecture, there were many foreign architects who worked in Poland, for instance, in the Baroque, but also many natives as well, so it's true in music. Though another reason why I think it's obscure, I believe, is that in many ways, the most brilliant time of Polish Baroque music is actually the 17th century, the early and mid-Baroque. And if you look at the development of interest in Baroque music like the 20th century, it's often the late Baroque that's first rediscovered in the 20th century, the early to mid-20th century, and often instrumental music. Whereas the most brilliant, surviving at any rate, monuments of Polish Baroque music are actually vocal instrumental and church music. And so that was discovered a little bit later in the early music movement, as it's called, the 60s, 70s. And around that time, just as it happened, many actually works that were in archives were rediscovered and published by Polish scholars largely. So there was a huge wave of publication of scores that happened, 60s, 70s, 80s. And then these started to be only recorded in the 80s, 90s, and aughties, and even the teens up until recently. And so it's really something that is new, in fact, in the scheme of things, a knowledge of it, and the ability for people to go and discover it. So that's why it's out of the shadows. All right, so I won't say any more about myself. John did a very good job of that. So let's look at some background concepts now, which are, I think, useful for understanding the music of the Baroque. And in fact, in the Baroque period of music, there were really two kinds of styles, largely speaking. The prima practica, as it was called by perhaps the founder of the Baroque music's brother, Giulio, who was also a writer on music. Claudio Monteverdi was the composer, was the most famous early Baroque composer, establishes the style. His brother Giulio, though, it comes up with a very important distinction, There is the first practice, prima practica of music, which is counterpoint, or more broadly, polyphony. So there are several voices going at once, singing more or less independent but interrelated melodies. So a very simple example of that would be a round, like row, row, row your boat. You guys are probably quite familiar with that. But also things like canons, like Pachelbel's canon, which is a much more sophisticated example of that. So you have then emphasis on almost equally important lines that are melodies and that are then coordinated harmonically. So that is an art, though, that goes back to the Renaissance, and it develops in some new ways in the Baroque, but it's basically in continuity with what came before. And I have here a portrait of the guy who is perhaps the embodiment of the first style or first practice in music in the Baroque period, and that's Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina, the famous Roman composer. Several of his students would become some of the leading composers in Poland in the early 17th century. But he indicates that kind of conservative aspect of Baroque music. But then the new thing, which was more purely Baroque, was what's called the second practice, or the secunda pratica. And this was accompanied melody, maybe a more familiar kind of music popularly, where you have accompanists who play chords typically and a lead melody. And very often, especially in the early Baroque, that was sung, but it could be played by other instruments. Other voices could be added. It could be a duet. It could be a trio of singers or melody instruments. But the simplest version of it, and the most basic, was monody, as it's called, one voice and accompanying chords. This allowed a different kind of expressiveness, and many of the operatic tricks that are known later, like runs, for instance, that will embellish a melody, or a certain kind of direct expressiveness of the singer singing to you through melody, expressive melody. This is what the second practice really allowed. So that's the new kind of dynamic thing. Okay, guys, if you're following me, that's one very important distinction, because both practices survive into the Baroque period and often interact some as well. There's another kind of little technical thing I'd like to bring in, though, and this is tonal and modal organization of music. And a tonal organization of music is something that we're familiar with in the key system. If you listen to classical music, you might hear pieces in A minor, okay, or C major or whatever. But in tonal organization, basically what you have is a strongly defined key center, and there is a progression of chords that is especially related to the key center in order to make certain kinds of musical effects. So chords being, of course, groups of tones that are sounded at once, the major and minor chord being the most basic. But in tonal organization, as it is developing in the early Baroque period, is kind of a more or less new practice. You had then an organization of music where usually the chords are done in a certain succession so that the harmonic tension, the deviation from the original key center, increases gradually and reaches a height of tension, and then it's released back to the key center. And this allowed then intensification of musical language. You could organize chords to create an intense effect. And Monteverdi, which I mentioned before, Claudio Monteverdi, the famous Italian composer, is one of the people who really pioneer that at the beginning of the Baroque. Modal organization, on the other hand, was more typical of the earlier kind of music in the West, the chant and the earlier kind of polyphony, where you had basically a more relaxed approach to harmony. The music tends to float more harmonically. You have a situation where harmonic tension may suddenly appear and disappear, and except at the cadence points, at the ends of major sections, there isn't that drive typically to a sort of key centers as strongly. There is a key center, but it is more muted in the way it's asserted. and typically allows more variation of scales as well. The church modes, if you guys are familiar with that, involve other kind of scale patterns that you don't have in the simple major and minor system that was emerging. So basically the first practice tended to be modal and the second practice tended to be tonal. But as the Baroque period goes on, the two sort of influence each other. And so this was, again, though, a new way of organizing music and tonal organization that allowed more intense expression of emotions in certain ways. Although to some people, the modes and the more gentle, kind of meditative mood they could create was regarded as kind of classic. All right, so what is Polish in all this is the question I ask. Well, in a certain sense, nothing. It's a lot of the models for this came from abroad, although you did have a very interesting, though somewhat provincial Renaissance musical culture in Poland doing the first practice. A lot of the basic materials come from the outside into Poland in the 17th century in music. So Polish musical culture is cosmopolitan in many ways. It does take on a local color, which I'll talk about in a variety of ways, but it's really international in many respects. And that wasn't unusual for many parts of Europe. Italy is the center of Baroque music early on, and it spreads out from there. All right, well, now beginning of a golden age is what I've called this slide here. So basically what you had at the beginning of the Baroque period was a couple kings, the first of which was Sigismund III, Zygmunt Sccachi, who really started to import Italian musicians in a major way to Poland, in a way that had not happened before. And some of them were very, very skilled composers, for instance. Many of them came from Rome. Rome being the center of the compositional school, put it that way, that centered on Palestrina and was deeply imbued in the first practice, but was also learning the second practice. And in fact, the first really major composer to come to Rome was Luca Marenzio was his name in the 1590s. And he was someone whose music was the rage in late Elizabethan England. He was regarded as the most important, most expressive composer that everyone wanted to imitate in Elizabethan England. But he actually comes to Poland, and his style is what's called mannerist. It has some Baroque elements, and it also has some more conservative elements. And I think I would like to now play you an example of this. And this was a mass that he seems to have written for the Polish Parliament's meeting in 1596. It seems to have been performed in October 1596 in what today is the Warsaw Cathedral, or then the Collegiate Church of St. John in Warsaw. It's polychoral, which was an important kind of mannerist or transitional Renaissance Baroque style. We have multiple choirs that answer each other. And I'm going to play you basically the Hosanna and Benedictus for this Mass. And basically the Hosannas will be very mannerist. There's big leaps in the melodies that helps create a striking effect. There's what's called chromaticism, lots of tones outside the standard 8 tones of the Western scale. Then the Benedictus is almost straight old Roman school. There's a part of that school of Palestrina. It's in canon. It's very lovely. So what happened typically in the ritual at this point, I'll just explain, is that the priest actually started the canon of the Mass, the consecration, silently while the choir was singing the Holy, 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 or the Sanctus. Then the first Hosanna would come. The choir would stop. The priest would do the consecration. And then with Benedictus, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, the choir would start again. So the Benedictus was then a greeting of Jesus becoming present in the Eucharist. So you'll hear then the mannerist Hosanna, and then I'll play the Benedictus. So you hear there the choirs answering each other closely in antiphony. So it creates this kind of swirling impression then of a certain beauty then that is, I suppose, referring to the divine presence in a certain sense. And this then will be very typical also of the early Baroque. You have different choirs that are stationed in different parts of a space and parts of a church, and they will answer each other and create sort of natural spatial or stereo effects. It was a way of creating also more massive sound than anyone had ever heard up until that time. And many of the Venetians would, in fact, excel at that. All right, so, although Marenzio was a Roman. All right, there's also another then great composer that comes to Warsaw from Rome, Asprilio Pacelli. And he was a composer who was a little more advanced in a certain way than Marenzio. He had actually been a choir boy of Palestrina, but he was someone who was very, very deeply into the polychoral sound, the polychoral style. He'll write, for instance, a work for Sigismund, Dum esset rex, When the King shall come, from the Song of Songs. And he will, in fact, write this for 5 choirs, 20 voices, 20 different voice parts, which could have been doubled also by instruments. It would create a massive effect then in a given space. And so this was something that's very suitable for a royal chapel, where the king was. The services should be magnificent. They indicate then the greatness of the king and his good taste and his honoring of religion, too, and of the church. And Sigismund, as you guys may know, was very interested in the Catholic Reform or the Counter-Reformation. All right, so Pacelli was a little further along. One just a little interesting thing about Pacelli, that's his picture there. It was in the Cathedral of Warsaw, destroyed by the Nazis in 1944. He died in Poland. He was buried there. And in fact, he actually had a lot of his music published in the mid-20th century. And the reason why is actually hinted at by his name. Pacelli, who was the Pope during World War II? Pius XII, Eugenio Pacelli, who was his direct descendant, actually. Descended from a son of Pacelli, who he left in Poland before he came to Italy. And so this is a way in which the Poles were making the point to Pius XII. We have this connection not only to Italy and the papacy, but also your family. Well, then comes the second Italian wave, as I've called it, continued. And this is Giovanni Francesco Anerio, who was someone who wrote not only in the first practice and the polychoral tradition of the massive Baroque, as it came to be called, but also in that second practice proper in monody. He could write then expressive music that was chords and accompaniment. So he indicates then a certain advance in style. And then the last of the great Italian masters brought in by Zygmunt Sccachi is a man named Marco Sccachi. And he was someone who was fully capable in the new style. He was a Roman, but he could also write in the Venetian way of someone like Claudio Monteverdi very well. He's very famous as a music theorist. So in fact, he will occasion a great musical debate that will actually grip Germany as well as Poland, because there was a conservative German musician in Gdańsk whose name was Paul Ziefert, well known in Germany, who wrote music that was a little more in the Renaissance style, the Renaissance tradition. And he was very critical of Italian music as being newfangled and not as good as the older traditions. So Sccachi will write, in fact, a very famous work, the Cribra Musicum, the musical sieve, to sort out what's good and bad in Ziefert's work. And he basically accused Ziefert of combining styles in a way that was inappropriate, not also practicing proper tonal practices in his music. So he basically says that Seifert is an incompetent and he doesn't know what he's talking about. This would create a great musical controversy throughout Germany. And many German musicians would weigh in. In fact, by and large, Sccachi and his Polish backers would win the debate. He would, in fact, gain a qualified approval from, for instance, Heinrich Schütz, who was the most important German composer of the day, would actually cautiously, while praising Seifert, take Sccachi's side, at least as far as his own practice went. So he's an important figure then in the musical history of Europe. Now, Sccachi was someone, as I said, who could write in the new style, and I'll play you an example of his music, which is, in fact, something he wrote for the next king after Władysław. So there you see a definite lead melody and accompaniment, right, with a couple supporting instruments as well. So that's definitely the second practice that I talked about at the beginning of my talk. All right. Well, speaking of opera, there is a very interesting connection of early opera to Poland, which a lot of people are not aware of. And in fact, the Vasa kings were important patrons and dedicatees, you can say, of early operas. The opera being in some ways the most revolutionary new genre in music that was emerging in Italy at this time. So one of the early Italian works of opera that are majorly important, that has a Polish tie, in fact, is the first opera written by a woman, Francesco Caccini, called La Liberazione di Rogerio dall'Isola dell'Alcina. So this was, in fact, dedicated to Władysław IV when he was a prince visiting Florence. And as it happened, his aunt, who was a Habsburg princess, was regent of Florence, and she dedicates then this work to Caccini. It has Francesca Caccini and her court poet come up with a suitable text, which was all about, in fact, an episode from a famous Italian work, Orlando of Furioso by Ariosto, that, in fact, it is basically marriage theme. So young Władysław was thinking of getting married at this point. So it's really all about a young woman who is a Christian hero, and she falls in love with a great Muslim warrior who is prophesied to perhaps convert to Christianity and die early. But as it happens, an evil sorceress, Elcina, will enchant him and bring him to this island of pleasures where he forgets about his fate. And so basically, the lady love of Ruggiero Bramante must go to a good sorceress, Melissa, who will free then Elcina from this island. So it's kind of a heraldic and also a humanistic kind of reference also to legend and myth, interpreted in often a way that is allegorical to praise then current people, address current political situations, often with a strong moral content as well, figuratively. And maybe I shall play you just a very brief excerpt from this opera to give an example of what opera of this time was like. This opera, I should say, was probably staged in Poland a few years later, although definite evidence is actually not forthcoming. But certainly the libretto, the text, was translated into Polish and published in Kraków several years after Władysław saw it. And right about that time, the Italians of the Royal Chapel started to stage operas regularly for King Sigismund and Prince Władysław, or Królewicz Władysław. So this is the beginning of the opera, when Neptune is going to come in and sing. And then he's going to cue in, or at least in the full version, they cut that here, the River Vistula to sing a part about the glorious Prince Władysław and his victories over the Muscovites and the Tartars. And then all the water spirits will join in a chorus. So if you have the handout, there's a translation of the text. Neptune is going to, who this is King Neptune, is going to start off the praises of Władysław and then call Apollo to help in the singing. Say now that he's marveling with all Tuscany, that the great Sarmatian king has come. So the monarch of the sea pays him homage. The water spirits to honor the man who defeated the Muscovites and the fierce Tartars.
vita in pace, chi vince in guerra, il moscovita e trace, e servi rese, il tartari
This is historically informed staging, at least this part of it is. Slow movements, very stylized, like Baroque opera. So you notice the monody again and the use of runs sometimes. Although Caccini was a relatively conservative user of this, she was regarded as very subtle and clever in her musical characterizations. So another important opera that is dedicated to a Polish king is Il Sant Alessio, which was on Saint Alexis of Rome. And that one was done actually in a nice big blowout presentation by French TV about 10 years ago, dedicated to another of Sigismund's sons, Prince Alexander, or Królewicz Alexander, who dies early. But that was another pattern that was used in opera in Poland. That was Sant Alessio was the first opera to really use extensive symphonia or overtures, as we would say today. So again, it's very important in the development of the genre. Marco Sccachi then took in part these two operas we know as models, and then he wrote up to 10 operas, he and the other musicians of the Royal Chapel, for the Vasa kings in Poland, setting up the first opera theater outside of Italy in all of the world. And unfortunately, the music is lost. So that gives you a sense, though, of the style that he presumably used. We have the librettos, but not the actual music. So Poland is important, then, in the early history of opera. All right, it's about the time I stopped talking about Italians, though, and I'll talk now about native Poles, because around the middle of the 17th century, there is a great change, then, in leadership of Polish music. Many Poles had been in the Royal Chapel, often as instrumentalists, but they didn't play a leading role in many cases. We started to have, even in the first half of the 17th century, some Poles who were very expert composers. Mikołaj Zieleński of Warka, for instance, who could write very well in the Venetian style as well as the Roman style, very lovely, massive polychoral works in many cases, as well as some very early style monodies. And he published a collection of church music in these styles in Venice in 1611. He was thought of highly enough that he was published in Italy. He seems to have worked, in fact, for the primate of Poland, whose name was Baranowski. And so this shows how other centers within Poland, major churchmen, are beginning to cultivate the kinds of musicians that can produce this new high-quality modern music. Marcin Mielczewski is another very important Polish composer who begins as an instrumentalist in the Royal Chapel. And then he becomes a major composer of his own right for another of the royal sons, who became, in fact, Bishop of Płock and Wrocław, and had his own chapel, Karl Ferdinand Vasa. And he writes some music that is wonderful, brilliant, colorful church music, and also instrumental music. And the instrumental music has survived a little less, but it is of a quite high quality. I'm going to play you a piece from, in fact, his surviving instrumental music. And this, in fact, let me just see here. Oops, let me find it, sorry. There we go. This, in fact, is a canzona, obviously Italian title, but it works in many tunes that were popular in Poland at the time. So you have this Polish color then appearing in Baroque music. I'll just play you part of this. It's a long piece, but I'll give you a flavor of Mielczewski's music. It'll go on working in more melodies and repeating with variations some of the same themes. You'll notice then there are two solo instruments, violins, and they were common throughout Europe, but violins were especially favored in Poland. They were regarded as an instrument the Poles were especially good at. And then there are the continuo instruments, as they're called, the chordal accompany instruments. The music is lively in terms of its rhythms. You notice it's very typical of, well, much Baroque, but especially Mielczewski. And there's a little bit of imitation of lines of melodic patterns between the instruments. There's a little bit of the little hint of the first practice coming into what's basically a second practice kind of work. So that's very typical of Mielczewski. He will blend carefully elements of the old and the new. Okay, oops, oh, sorry. Another very great composer of Polish, I guess you could say, citizenship slightly anachronistically, was Barłomiej Pękiel. His origin is a little unsure. He could have been of German origin, but he clearly was treated as a naturalized Polish subject in the royal records. And he is someone who served with Mielczewski about the same time in the royal chapel. But after the troubles that come with the Swedish deluge that really will wreck a lot of the country, along with the earlier Cossack uprising, Pękiel will leave the royal chapel. He was actually the first Polish chapelmeister after Sccachi left back to Italy. But very soon after he gets that position, the royal chapel is dissolved because of all the trouble and the war that grips Poland. Pękiel will then settle in Kraków, and you will become the main composer on the Wawel Hill, especially for the group of priest soloists that were very prominent at that time on the Wawel, that were known as the Rorentists. And he will write lots of music in a kind of modern version of the first practice. Although he was a very excellent, or excuse me, he would write a lot in Kraków in the first practice, but he was a very good composer in the second practice as well. So I'm going to play you a piece of his that really indicates his excellence in that Baroqueified, we might say, version of the earlier style of a cappella church music that is polyphonic or contrapuntal in nature. This is a Lamb of God, Agnus Dei, from his Missa Brevis. And you will notice, in fact, that especially in the second statement of the Lamb of God, it says, Miserere nobis, have mercy on us. It becomes very intensely expressive. And then for the last statement of the Lamb of God, he will bring the work to a climax by a really awesome setting of Dona Nobis Pacem, full of a life and, in fact, scalar kind of figures. They're very typical of Pękiel. I think you can sense the emotionalism in that music and the spirituality as well. And Pękiel, that way, he was a colleague of Mielczewski, but his church music has a very different character. It's much more mystical, and it has often a minor vibe to it. This is obviously imitative counterpoint. You probably heard the voices imitating each other, but it's also very harmonically informed too. It's distinctively Baroque that way. It's just not a restatement of Renaissance style. So Mielczewski and Pękiel are regarded as perhaps the two greatest composers of the Polish Baroque, save maybe one. On the slide, I do have a little shout out to Franciszek Lilius, or Francesco Gigli, who was Pękiel's predecessor at Kraków. But he was actually trained as a young man. His father was an Italian musician who worked in Poland. But he was sent back to Italy to study with Frescobaldi, the greatest organist of the age. And he came back to Poland, became a priest, became a native, or I should say a naturalized Pole. And he became the most important of the composers of Kraków. But Pękiel in that mass is actually referring to an earlier mass for four voices written by Lilius, as well as a theme by an Austrian composer whose name was Leuton. But this is the way in which you can see, though, a local tradition kind of developing. So Pękiel was drawing then off an earlier work by one of his predecessors. All right. I already played you an example of one of Mielczewski's canzo. But I want to mention that there were also other important instrumentalists at this time. Adam Jarzębski was someone who, in fact, worked for the Elector of Brandenburg, was sent to Italy to learn then a new Italian style of instrumental music. He comes back to not Berlin, but Warsaw, and enters the service of the Polish Royal Chapel. And his instrumental works are regarded as an important kind of bridge of Italian styles of the time, the most recent Italian instrumental styles, not only in Poland, but also in Germany. Tarquinio Marula, actually an Italian, but he was someone who was very important in what's called the development of the church sonata in Baroque stylistic terminology or terminology of forms. He really will actually pioneer a kind of a sonata that will really have less voices in it, less instruments, less massive effects, but also more expressiveness, like we heard in Mielczewski. He spends a couple years in Poland. Subasati is another very important violinist whose early years were in Poland, and his violin sonatas survive, and they are an important example of instrumental music. You can easily Google and find examples. I want to give a shout out to also the organists of Poland, who in fact compiled not only in the 17th but also the 16th century some of the greatest, in the sense of largest, organ tablatures in Europe, and especially what's called the Pepplin tablature, which was compiled in fact in northern Poland close to Gdańsk. This in fact is a very massive monument of organ works, and there's also a Warsaw tablature, which is a little smaller, that will show the strong nature of organ composition and performance in Poland at the time. All right. Well, I want to give a shout out now to another side of Polish music, which perhaps is a little more familiar to many of you. And this is actually song, including religious song. Probably most of you, if not all of you, are familiar or even maybe very familiar with the Gorzkie Żale, of course, famous sung Polish Lenten devotion, the Bitter Laments. But this is something that originates actually in the Baroque in Warsaw in about the middle of the Baroque, around 1700. Many Christmas carols also that we sing today, if we're Polish or of Polish descent, also have their roots in this time. So this is a complex question, that there's the question of texts and also melodies. But in fact, a variety of Christmas carols that are popular today do in fact have their origin in both text and melody in the Baroque. Fujro Biależy is one of them. Lulajże Jezuniu. Gdyż liczna Pana is another one. Przybliżeli do Betlejem is half Baroque. The melody has actually changed a lot, but the words come from the period. There's also court airs and secular songs. There's also uniquely a Polish language opera that is written between 1680 and 1700 on hunting hares for Christmas, a comic opera. So I will maybe play you one of the examples here. Would you prefer to hear the comic opera excerpt or the court airs, the love song? Any preferences? No? Well, we've heard an opera already, so maybe I will go for the court song. And this is an example of a fairly recent kind of discovery, in that for a long time it was thought we had for the love songs of the Polish nobility just the texts, and very few, if any, melodies. But in the 1960s, there was rediscovered in Kraków, in fact, a Eastern Polish musical monument bound to a Uniate Missal that actually had the melodies, so we could actually see what melodies the texts were sung to. And this is one, Służyłam ja dosyć, Tobie dosyć.
Służyłem ja Tobie dosyć przez tak czas długi.
would be an example of the kind of music that was cultivated by the ordinary nobility of Poland, for instance, in their feasts and their entertainments. Now, coming to the next period, and really the last period of the Baroque period, or a sub-period of the larger Baroque period, we can talk about the middle and late Baroque. So this is kind of an uneven picture in Poland. The wrecking of many cultural institutions that had happened in the deluge and its consequences in fact, did have, in certain sense, a negative impact on Polish cultural life. No longer was the Royal Chapel a major center for music. But to make up for that, you did have a profusion then of church institutions that started to cultivate music in the modern way. And maybe with about a generation, or a generation is probably too extreme, but a couple decades at least of delay between the kind of new patterns that typically appear in Italy, but they had spread to Poland, and they were actually reasonably up to date at least. So there are very many minor church composers we know about from the middle to late Baroque, about 1670 to 1750. Maciej Wronowicz, probably a layman, worked in the Włocławek Cathedral. Damian Stachowicz, who was a piarist. Paweł Szaprawski, who was a Benedictine. Many of the composers were actually clergymen, though not all of them. And some of them have, in fact, very competent and lovely works that they produce, though typically for these composers, it's just a handful that survive. We know that there were many, many more works written by them that survive in contemporary inventories, but the troubled history of Poland led to a lot of them being lost. One composer who stands above them is also a religious, although we know relatively little about his life, Stanisław Sylwester Szarzyński. In fact, has more surviving works, and he's clearly the best of them. And depending on our time, let's see, how are we doing here? Well, it's getting a little late, so I won't maybe play a piece from him, but if you know the Latin antiphon, Marian antiphon, Ave Regina Caelorum, and you enter that into a search engine, and you can put Szarzyński in, you can easily hear a very lovely solo piece of his for, in fact, the church. All his pieces except one are for the church. And the one that isn't is actually sort of for the church too. It's a church sonata, but it's instrumental. I'm going to go on and talk about perhaps the most important then of the middle and late Baroque Polish composers. Is a little bit later. He dies in 1734. His name is Grzegorz Gerwazy Gorczycki, or GGG was his monogram he would sign on his manuscripts. So Stanisław Sylwester Szarzyński was SSS. He'd sign all his works SSS. So this, in fact, you see on the screen is Gorczycki's funeral monument. And you can see there he's ab omnius gemma sacerdotum vocati. He was called by all the gem of the clergy. He was someone who was very famous in Kraków. He was of Silesian birth and trained in Prague and Vienna. He was someone who didn't abandon his flock, as many priests did during the deluge, and or I should say the Great Northern War in the second wreck of Poland almost in the first decades of the 18th century. Very involved in the charitable activities of Kraków. But he was also a superb composer of both first and second practice music. The first practice music he wrote for the Wawel clergy and the Rorentists is consistently lovely and often of very high musical qualities too. And his music in the second practice or more modern style is often just brilliant. He's sometimes called the Polish Handel, which I think is a bit misleading, because if he wrote for the theater, it was only a little bit, whereas Handel was really very largely a theater composer. but Gorczycki learned a lot from the opera of his time, and I think you hear this. And the analogy to Handel, I think, comes from the brilliance of some of this church music for instruments and voices and choir, and which has a kind of Handelian brilliance if you compare it to like some of the choruses of his famous Messiah, Handel. get a sense then for the brilliance and the joy in much of his music that is written then for instruments and voices. Or in this case, instruments and choirs, but often solo voices as well. All right, well, I just want to make a few more points in closing. And one is that there is an interesting kind of German connection of major composers of the late Baroque in Germany to Poland. J.S. Bach, for instance, one of his proudest titles was in fact a Kapellmeister, or really, I should say, a composer. He wasn't technically the Kapellmeister, but the composer to Augustus III. So he was very happy to be the royal composer for the King of Poland. Never went to Poland, but there is nevertheless a Polish element in his music. And in fact, for instance, when he would write his famous Mass in B minor, regarded as the very greatest of his works, and thanks to the king for actually having made him the royal composer, he would, at the end of the Gloria, there is, of course, the text in the Gloria, "For you alone are holy, you alone are the Lord, you alone are the Most High." And at that point, the music, especially the horn parts, break into a polonaise. So there's the practice then in the late German Baroque, especially in the Saxon sphere that is, of course, tied politically to Poland. There is an association of the polonaise with glory, royal glory, and divine glory. So the polonaise then becomes an important kind of symbolic element sometimes in the music of Bach. Georg Philipp Telemann, also regarded one of the very greatest German composers, he also worked for the Vasa Royal Chapel and therefore for the kings of Poland. But also he, at an early stage of his career, went to Żary in Silesia, where he, in fact, heard Polish dances, and he started to incorporate them into his music, and many of his suites will have Polish dances in them. And so there's a very active interest in some of the major composers of the German Baroque in Polish, especially Polish dance music. Lastly, we might mention here Johann Adolf Hasse, which is not a household name, but he's one of the more important figures in Germany in the transition between the Baroque and the classical period, the next great period in music. And he was someone who worked for Augustus II and Augustus III, kings of Poland and electors of Saxony, of course. He would, in fact, write operas in the newest style of music known as galant, which was simpler and more direct in many ways than what had gone before in the Baroque. And he was the real up-to-date composer. Bach was very respected, but he was a little bit behind the times in some aspects of his musical style. Hasse was the person who was really fully up-to-date. And he will write, in fact, a number of operas that are put on in Warsaw, often as these second performances. Often he'd premiere them in Italy or someplace else, but then they'd often get performed in Warsaw very early. And so he'd be an example of someone who's on the cutting edge of Germany, cutting edge in Germany of development of Baroque into classical style. And he was spending time also in Warsaw. Last, I just want to mention that in Polish music, in the proper sense of the term, music by Poles, in the narrowest sense of the term, you also have a transition then from Baroque to early classical. It's slow in Poland, and many of the great church composers of the time, they will, in fact, stick with the Baroque style longer than in some parts of Europe, but including more gallant sort of elements that are a slow transition to the classical. Mateusz Zwierzchowski, who was in fact a Kapellmeister at the Gniezno Cathedral, and that's actually a fine Baroque altarpiece from the Gniezno Cathedral, was one example of that. Unfortunately, a great many of his works were lost, but his Requiem, a very lovely work, does survive. And then Marcin Józef Żebrowski, whose work was actually known and respected in the West, the only other composer other than Mielczewski to be widely distributed in the West. So he's another example of someone who's being recorded more today, and you can easily Google him and hear musical examples under his Polish name, Jarzębski, or the form of the name he often used in his foreign contacts, Zebro. Yes, so he is an example then of the way Polish music was respected abroad in many cases. And it might be interesting just to say in conclusion that historically the most important part of Polish Baroque music was probably that early period, the controversy with Sccachi, it's known throughout Germany, the works of Mielczewski and Pękiel, which, by the way, the young J.S. Bach learned in the repertoire he had to study as a choir boy in the choir school of Lüneburg in Germany. To him, Mielczewski and Pękiel would have been the ancients, which helped him learn about music. But right toward the end of the period, then, you do have a revival of Polish music and reestablishment slowly of foreign contexts of a very lively kind. And Zebro can be taken as an example of that. So the early classical, late 18th century is a time of new things, new developments, new dynamism in Polish music. And it would somewhat be stymied, unfortunately, by the partitions, but nevertheless, in the immediate aftermath of the Polish Baroque, there was a very interesting culture of early classical music in Poland that is just being rediscovered today. Composers like Józef Zeidler, who worked in Gostin, many working in northern Poland, actually, or at Jasna Góra in the south. And yes, these composers then are an open book. That's a chapter of Polish music that's still being written in terms of modern appreciation and knowledge of it, that early classical Polish music.